Oh, well, hello there. Welcome back to Introduction to Cultural Anthropology and our discussion on art and the media. So, what is art and how does it influence uh, a community, a culture? Art can give us an amazing amount of information about how a community is going to behave, how a community puts value upon things, how it represents certain ideas or cultural values. All of this can be determined through artistic practice and expression, right? It can tell us all kinds of information about what's happening in a community, what's changing in a community, what are the things that have lots of value and have stayed to be a major component of that community. So let's talk a little bit about that. So, first of all, what is art? I think it's really important to sort of recognize that there is a lot of different types of art out there. Um, and it's usually through this sort of expression of ideas, but it comes in lots of different ways. And it is consumed in lots of different ways. So, what I want you to do is take a couple of minutes and think about what is art and how do we experience art. So list out a few things, write them down. We'll pause for a moment and then continue. Okay. Hopefully you've had a moment to consider what art is. Let's give some examples. Okay. So first of all, a lot of times when we think about art, we think about music, right? Musical expression, whether or not it's through singing or through the use of instruments, creating complex melodies, or just beating on something to a rhythm, right? We have these different ways of uh, recognizing this as an artistic expression, right? So, yeah, obviously, music is going to be one of those things. Literature, right? The writing down of stories and um, creating different ideas, both fictional and um, biographical about individuals and peoples and experiences to share those kinds of ideas. Stories. And when I talk about stories, I'm talking about the same thing about literature, but also oral stories or oral traditions, people telling tales, getting up and even things like comedy, telling jokes, um, being able to express ideas and emotions through storytelling. Paintings, whether or not it's the Sistine Chapel or the Mona Lisa or newspaper rock with pictographs and petroglyphs that go back hundreds, if not thousands of years, telling the stories of the people that lived there. Um, or hieroglyphics in the middle of a tomb in ancient Egypt that is telling the story of a god that once existed. Uh, Paintings can be a lot of different things. Plays, right? The actual physical movement and telling of a story. Again, whether or not it's fictional or of an event that took place. Um, Design, and by design, we're talking about creating oftentimes space um, or conceptual ideas, things like architecture, right? Architecture is a means in which we create spaces for people to exist. Um, and that can have a big design on things like cities, right? Uh, Usually there were city designers that would lay out and organize how a city was built and have lots of different attributes. Um, that a culture would want to have in that design. Um, Clothing, that should be pretty obvious, right? What do we find to be beautiful or aesthetically pleasing? Why do we wear certain clothing, either for ourselves, the things that we enjoy, or to possibly entice a mate um, to go out and find a relationship? Or what is appropriate for our age? All of these things can be connected to art. Food, of course, right? Food can be very much artistic. Whether or not you're going to go experience, um, excuse me, um, a five-star restaurant, right, where the dish itself is going to cost $150, and you're going to taste a wine that the bottle itself costs $200. But that moment that you get to experience that is something that is coveted. Or whether or not you're going to go down the street and find that taco stand, right? And the artistry and the flavor is just as impressive as that 150, you know, dollar, dollop sized of food that you just barely consumed versus a taco, which, I mean, tacos are life. Anyway, um, games, right? Games and how they are designed, whether or not they are video games or board games or card games or games that you play outside, the artistry of soccer, right? Or even things like football, right? There can be an artistry to the physicalness of the act, right? And that brings us to things like martial arts, right? The ability to use your body in um, ways that can be both beautiful or lethal, right? And we can look at all kinds of different martial arts to see how they use and combine technique that can be so amazing and attractive to watch and to also participate in. The art of media. So when we talk about media, we're talking about the transmission of information from a creator to a consumer, right? And the media is the medium in which it is transmitted. So when we talk about print media, that's things like newspapers or books. If we're talking about like television, right, that is televised media that's coming through the TV, multimedia, that could be the internet, social media, that could be things like Facebook and Instagram. So when we talk about media in general, it's usually the medium in which that platform has been created to transfer information from again one place to another to that consumer. Um, a lot of what we're going to be looking at is sort of like the Western traditions and ideals when it comes to um, sort of the consumption of media. And this is where we get into sort of defining things like fine art, um, popular art, and then things like primitive art. And we'll get into each one of these. So what is fine art? Right. And when we think about fine art, it's usually sort of an exclusive experience, right? If I wanted to go visit, uh, if I wanted to see the Mona Lisa, it is an experience for you to go to Paris and go to the Louvre and be able to stand in that art museum and experience, right, the Mona Lisa. Um, that is fine art, right? Something that is coveted, something that isn't easily accessible. Yeah, I can go online and look at the Mona Lisa, but it's not the same thing as experiencing the Mona Lisa, right? Same way with going to like a five-star restaurant, right? Paying a huge amount of money for the exclusive chance to be able to consume something beautiful and artistically created. Um, or going to like a fashion show, right? Having access in that moment to not only see um, the clothing that is being expressed, but those who are wearing it as a part of that art experience, right? So we usually see things like that as being sort of fine art. And then we have popular art, right? Popular art being that this is stuff that we regularly and have easy accessibility to. Television, movies, broadcast music, things that you might hear on like the radio, things like graffiti where it's just there and you have to experience it. Um, paperback books, different concepts. Even when we think about like religious art, is oftentimes sort of also considered to be popular art because it's popular in many places and experienced there. We'll talk about primitive art a little bit later on in the lecture as we discuss these various issues. It's important, however, to understand that anthropologists, we try and not distinguish between what is considered to be fine art and public art, but how communities experience that art. Why do they treat this different type of art differently? And what makes art valuable and what makes it available for public consumption? And what are the different values that go into that? Because not all art is treated equally. Um, so we need to figure out the cause behind it, what's happening here. Uh, Art can be complex or simple, it can be symbolic, shared, or coveted, right? When we think about complex art, that could be the difference between an orchestral and choir based musical piece, Mozart or Beethoven, versus me taking a stick and banging on a 5-gallon bucket, as a drum, right? Complex, simple. Both music, my banging on a drum probably isn't going to gather the same sort of appreciation as Mozart will. It can be simple, right? It can be symbolic of something else and of an expression or an idea, a concept that is easily recognizable. Oftentimes, I think of the crucifix as an example of this. That is oftentimes seen symbolically. So if you ever go to a church, each church might either have a different way of expressing that crucifix, that cross, either in an ornate description or a very basic and simple description. And that might show how that particular church is going to react to the Gospels and to the teachings within Christianity. Um, it might show the wealth of that community, whether or not it's a real basic design and what was available at the time to be created, or whether or not there was a lot of resources and they could put a lot of effort into that design work. So it can show us symbolically not only what's happening, but the amount of resources available within that community to propagate those ideas. And then shared and coveted. Um, Thinking about music, something like me banging on that drum, right, on that bucket. Uh, but if I do it good enough, I could put it onto social media and I could get, 1 million viewers to look at me banging on a bucket, right? Or is it coveted? Is it something that, say Beethoven, wrote a song but never got it published, never made it, and you have the art, the music in front of you, and you're the only one that can experience it, right? That's that coveted aspect of being able to just have it for yourself, or that one of a kind painting that's hanging over your fireplace that only you and those that you select to come and view it right? That's coveted art. Um, and again, it can be created for mass consumption, um, or it can be consumed by individuals. When we think about going to a restaurant, you can only experience it once, right? That food is created, then it is consumed. So that experience of art can be very unique, even though it might be open to the public. Each experience is probably going to be a little bit different versus something like broadcast TV or movies that are on like Netflix. You can go back and you can re-experience those things over and over again, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. So let's talk a little bit about who makes art. Okay. Uh, Anyone can make art, but does that make you an artist? Now, depending on what culture you're in, uh, will determine whether or not you are like a professional artist or just an everyday consumer of art or a creator of art. So, how do we value art, right? Do we see art that is unique and there's only one copy um, as being the most valuable? Again, that coveted piece of art above your fireplace. Or do we value art that is capable of being reproduced and broadcast to many, many people, such as, Taylor Swift or the Beatles, right? As they create songs and you have millions of people that go out and experience that music and can experience it over and over again. How do we look at that as far as value? Or what about that cute picture that your niece drew, who's 5 years old, and decided to draw a portrait of you, and when the realism isn't quite there, but it's got two eyes, a nose, and some hair, but you still value it, right? It's still something that you put on your refrigerator and leave there for sometimes years as an expression of that child, but it's something that they did for you, right? And then you value that piece of artwork, even though, yeah, it's scribbles, but it's valuable. So how we look at art in a cultural sense depends on, again, the consumer, um, who's producing it and why, and the kind of value that we put upon that kind of stuff. In Western culture, we oftentimes look at the creation of art done through artisans and professionals, right? Anyone can do art, but you're not an artist unless you're getting paid for it, unless you have become successful as an artist, and that oftentimes can look different in different ways, right? Are you a carpenter? Can you build, a beautiful table, or are you just gonna like, take a nail and connect a bunch of 2x4s together and create, a knockoff table? Um, or are you going to create something ornate and beautiful? How do we look at those kinds of things, right? um, so even like the daily consumption of that art um, is oftentimes looked at whether or not it's been done by that professional, that trained individual who has spent hours and days and months and years perfecting that trait or that skill. So we oftentimes look at the professional, right? The professional artist. Um, Even though we still see lots of art that's done on a daily basis, uh, but how is it getting consumed and shared? And those are different aspects that we will look at different cultures. So we look at art on all different levels, right? We look at it from um, the practical sense. Uh, Oftentimes, we will look at more like public art than we will at fine art, because that'll give us a sense more about what's going on in that community than looking at the highest examples of what that community can produce. Uh, what is being consumed on a daily basis by the population, right? If we look at things like Mozart and Beethoven, right? If we're thinking about music, seeing them as sort of like this pinnacle of artistic expression, and they've been dead for a couple hundred years, right? But they did this amazing stuff. And then we compare it to like Taylor Swift, right? Who is, arguably touching more people around the world than Beethoven or, uh, uh, Mozart have ever been able to reach out to. Uh, and so, how do we look at that art being consumed, right? And the ways that they can be consumed. How does the media influence that consumption? Uh, so, looking at sort of the practical information that we can gather, what kind of artwork might be on someone's wall in their own home. If they are like a religious family, are there going to be pictures or statues of deities, of Jesus, or of Vishnu, right? Or the Buddha, right? How do we look at that art, and how do we um, interact with it on a daily basis? And then how do we see that art again out in the public realm, right? What are the things that we, again, have easy access to? Um, and so we try and figure out why that art is that particular way. Like, what is it that creates that fine artness to it? Whether or not, if we look at like Beethoven or Mozart, there is this legacy of of art, and the fact that it was recorded, right? When you go back in time, there wasn't that many recordings of people's music, whether it was written down or passed on from generation to generation through that practice of art, right? Where today, modern day music can be, anyone can create music and then share that music in the public sphere. Um, and so, do we look at things that have that age as being really important? That it's old and it has survived and it is considered to be a masterful piece, even though that new piece of art that came out might have the same tones and feel and experience, but it's pop art, right? So how do we create those distinctions and understanding the cultural imperative behind that consumption of art? Okay, so let's do another exercise here. What do we consider to be beautiful? And I think this is a really important thing to sort of consider about our own society. What are the things that we consider to be of importance, of aesthetically pleasing senses? So what I want you to do is write down some examples. What do we find to be beautiful? And then we will go over some examples. So let's pause. Okay, so hopefully you've taken a chance to write some of this stuff down. Let's go over some examples. I put that here because I think it's important. We'll get to that in a second. So let's think about what we consider to be beautiful. So when we think about beauty, especially within a Western sense, we are oftentimes thinking about what is aesthetically pleasing, whether or not it's clothing or dress. How do we wear clothing? When do we wear certain clothing to certain events, right? And that can have a huge impact on things like dating and marriage, finding that mate out there. What about food? What about music? Right? We oftentimes think about the beautiful things, and so what I find beautiful is nature. Right? I love being out in nature. I love the mountains. I especially love being in forests and near uh, running water like rivers. And I can find in those places a particular style of beauty, right? That natural beauty, sort of both growth and decay, right? Because you've got all these trees, but you might have that fallen tree, but inside that fallen tree, there might be sprouts of another plant or a sapling that's using that decayed tree to grow from. So I find that something to be particularly beautiful. And there's certain types of music that I might find particularly beautiful. I love classical music, but because of my love for classical music, I also love things like, electronic dance music because I actually find a similarity between classical and EDM. Um, I love listening to 80s rock band music. Um, the Police and going back even further, Led Zeppelin, stuff like that. Um, what do we find beautiful in other people, right? What do we find attractiveness? Becomes really important to consider as well because a lot of times, again, our ideas of attractiveness can be tailored by media, right? If we think about, and I've given this example before, um, looking at things like the Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition, right? Um, how is the body presented, right? A lot of times, if we look at these covers of magazines, they are oftentimes creating unrealistic ideas about beauty, right? Eliminating um, any sort of blemishes or creating unrealistic um, bodies in general that just wouldn't be functional or healthy. But then that creates sort of this ideology of what becomes beautiful. Even taking things like Barbie dolls, um, or I remember as a kid playing with things like He-Man, right, and having these outrageous bodies that are in general unobtainable, right? But they create sort of an idealized sense of what is attractive. And those concepts of attraction have changed greatly over the years and look different in different cultures. Even things like, and I'm trying to remember the name of the culture and it's evaporating from me, but I believe they're in like Tanzania or somewhere within the continent of Africa, in which this community, the men um, compete against each other for attractiveness by consuming massive amounts of milk. Okay, and they develop these huge milk bellies, and in the process of doing this, they actually generate a lot of attraction from the women within their community. And part of it, even though, when we think about bodies and attractiveness within our culture, we don't look towards big bellies as being attractive. But in this community, this big milk belly shows that you have the resources to drink a lot of milk and to actually make yourself fat and happy, right? And at the end of this, whoever has the biggest milk belly uh, ends up winning and might win the heart and admiration of some woman that he's trying uh, uh, to get them to peep on him and say, yeah, hey, let's go hang out. Um, so, right, that big milk belly becomes attractive in the United States and in Europe. Uh, the concept of being super skinny as being attractive is actually relatively new. It used to be that if you had a little bit of extra girth to you, you were more attractive. And again, that had to do with having access to food and resources. If you were skinny, it was because you were undernourished, right? You were poor. You didn't have enough food to put that meat on your bones. And then that subtly changed over a number of decades in which that healthiness of having a little bit extra became less and less attractive, and having that sort of hourglass figure, especially when it came to women, all of a sudden started to change, and new ideas about beauty were put into place. So a lot of this can also be influential when we look at how media deals with that, right? Um, Again, how is beauty expressed over social media? How is beauty expressed by watching uh, movies and television shows, and watching our favorite musicians and the style that they use, and uh, the amount of effort they put into their physical appearance, um, and creating those expectations, and that can have a huge impact on both those expectations as an individual, and then what you might look for within um, your community. Okay, I put this in here because I think it's kind of important when we think about art, because this is a really important example of literature. George Orwell's 1984. They fear love because it creates a world they can't control. And I think a lot of times when we think about that expression of love, it's done through the practice of art. How do we express to each other these concepts, things like love, things like the things that we value? Um, and I think Orwell, if you haven't read Orwell or um, seen the movie or any other representations of it, you really should, because it talks about sort of like the control of imagery, of information, of thought, and when you look at art, especially, um, art can have a huge impact on how you perceive other people. Um, for example, I remember watching propaganda films, American propaganda films about the Japanese during World War II. And oftentimes the depictions of the Japanese were very dehumanizing, right? Um, and through that practice of art, you are conditioning a population to believe a certain aspect of that culture, and that if that culture is viewed in a certain way, then you would be more accepting of what might happen to those people, right? And so oftentimes when we're looking at things like war, right, we'll see the depictions uh, of people in those situations, the enemy, right, as being dehumanized, and that happens fairly often when we are looking at um, conditioning, even soldiers today, of who the enemy is, um, and the population that supports those activities. Who is the enemy? That's make fun of them. That's draw them in a terrible light, and that can have a huge influence on a population. Okay, we're going to pause there and then come back to this in just a few minutes. All right, we'll see you in a few.